In the last assignment, you may have already noticed the limitation of modeling or creating things just by using the primitives, right? And just as a reminder, the primitives are when you press Shift A, go to Mesh, these are the primitives that we have. And the limitation is that in real life, objects are rarely shaped by the primitive, right? For instance, if you wanted to create this Coke can, sure, it heavily resembles a cylinder, but simply putting down a cylinder and moving it to place will not really make us think that we have a Coke can, right? There's a clear difference between the shape on the left side and the shape on the right side, even though they're both cylindrical. So in this case, we need to develop more robust tools in modeling. Okay, but before we can do that, let's actually first analyze this cube, as that will help us with these new techniques. So right in front of us we have the default cube, or just the cube that spawns when you create the file. And the thing we know about cubes is that they have 6 sides, right? So there's a top side, there's a bottom side, front, back, and then there's the right side and then the left side. So there's 6 different sides. And the lesser known fact is that there's 12 edges. And what I mean by edges, it's these lines right here. Those are the edges, and there's 12 of them. And finally, there's also 8 vertices or points. And by points, I mean these sharp things right here. Now in 3D modeling, we refer to these 3 ideas using the names faces. So face is this thing at the top. We then have the edges. So these green things, they are the edges, and there's also a few of them on the back. And then we also have the vertices. So one of these blue points is called a vertex, multiples vertices, but that part doesn't really matter as long as you know what we're talking about when we say vertex. So the question is, why is this important? Well, let me just duplicate the default cube and move it to the side here. The reason why it's important is because we can actually manipulate all of these edges, all of the vertices, and all of the faces of any shape that we have. And the way that we can start manipulating these is by pressing Tab, and this will bring us to a whole new kind of setup. You'll see that on the right here we have a bunch of tools, but we will stay clear of those for now. And you have a few new buttons up here as well. So what we've entered is something called the edit mode, which it says right here. And now it gives us 3 options right here. We have the option of selecting a vertex, so these points along the outsides. We can also select the edge by selecting this edge thing, and we can select the entire edge. It's kind of hard to see, but you can select them. And we can also select the full face by pressing this thing right here, and now we can select individual faces. So now what we can do is use our G, R, and S buttons to manipulate not the entire object, but to manipulate either the faces, edges, or the vertices. So if I select this face here and I press G, I can now kind of move it. And when I left click, I can kind of see what I've done. So I made the cube into some weird shape. I can now select a different face. Sure, I can move it again, G, and I move it, or I can rotate it, or I can even scale it. So now I'm making even more interesting shapes that are now no longer found in our primitives. If I go into the edge select mode and I select an edge, I can also move just one edge. I can also scale an edge. Or I can press up here, get the vertex mode, or I can press 1 on my keyboard that is not on my number pad, just 1, and I can move just the vertex around wherever I want. So I can move them now individually. I'm going to input a cylinder to kind of show you the true strength of this. So I'm just going to delete this. I'm going to Shift A, Mesh, Cylinder. I will move the cylinder over. Now you may have always noticed that every time you have a cylinder, you kind of have these lines going up and down, up and down, up and down. So if we now select the cylinder and we enter the edit mode by pressing tab, then you see that actually every single one of those lines going up and down was an edge. And so we have a lot of faces. We have one big face at the top, one big face at the bottom, and we have a bunch of little rectangular faces going all around. And so now what we can do is we can select whichever edge we want, and we can kind of edit it to kind of do whatever we want it to do. And right now this kind of seems random, and it is, but why don't we select every second edge right here. So I select the first edge, then I shift select the next one over, skipping one, and I'll just keep going around and I'll select every single second edge. Like that. And now if I press S and I just scale, I made some weird, like a gear, like, or sun from up above. This looks like a sun. But if we look at it from the side, we don't want that. So I'll just also scale it down on the Z axis. So now we have some kind of a gear looking thing. And if I want to exit the edit mode, I'll just press tab again, and now we're at the object mode. Okay, so this kind of seems stronger, but I mean, how many of us want to actually model something that looks this silly, right? We want to model real things. Okay, so before we get started modeling real things, let's just get familiar with 3 or 4 new tools that we have at our disposal. So here I have the cube again. I will go into the edit mode and I can cycle through the vertices, the edges, or the faces by pressing 1, 2, or 3, and you can see it moving up here. 1, 2, and 3. And so now, if I press number 1, I see all of these vertices. And you can think of the vertices or the edges or the faces as control points. So I can, select a vertex and I can move it around. Okay, but say I want to have a control point between these two vertices right here. So I want to control this one thing here. Right now I don't have any vertices here, so I have to create them. So one way to create vertices between two established vertices, then I can press Control R, and then I can move my mouse around here. And as I'm moving it around, you can see these yellow squares that are beginning to form. If I left click, now we put 4 vertices here. And I can move them wherever I want, but I want them to be exactly in the middle, so I will just right click. That just moves them to the middle. Now I created more control points for me to play around with. So now I can actually select this point right here and move it where I want to. So again, Control R will give me loop cuts here. So I'm pretty much slicing my cube along this path right here. So what if I want 2 loop cuts? So I can press Control R, and while it's still yellow, before I left click, if I scroll wheel, this creates 2 loop cuts, and if I keep scrolling up, it will create more and more and more loop cuts. And if I left click and right click, it applies them all. Let me just undo that. Okay, there's another tool called the inset tool. For the inset tool, you do have to have a face selected. So let's just say I'll select the top face right here, and to inset you press the letter I and you move your mouse, and now it kind of created more control points on this top face, and I can also do whatever I want with these control points. So it's kind of like a roof being built. But let me Control Z back down here, so I can select any face I want, inset it to whatever I want. I can also do multiple insets, so I can inset, left click, and I can inset again, and I can keep insetting. Then there's this next tool called extrude. What extrude does is if I take this face right here and I press E, I pull out my geometry. And then say I select this face right here, I can pull it out as well. And I can keep pulling out geometry however I kind of want. If I select one of these trapezoids, and I can extrude those as well, and I can extrude up or down, whatever I want. And you can also extrude edges. So if I press number 2, I go to my edge select, and I press E, I can extrude just the edge. And then when you extrude an edge, that will extrude it into a face. Or if I take a vertex, so if I go to my vertex selection, I select one vertex, and I can extrude it, that will create an edge between two vertices. And the last tool that you have at your disposal is called the bevel. So let me, for example, select this edge right here. And if I press Control B and then move my mouse, it kind of cuts this piece right here. And you can also select multiple edges. So I just shift click those edges. And if I Control B, I'm now beveling these ones as well. If you want it to be a little bit more smoother, you can press Control B, and before you left click, use your scroll wheel. You can add more and more edges. And so now the smoothing is a little bit smoother. So yeah, I hope that helped with this part. The next video will use these tools to create few objects.